What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be talking about the best value pick in every single round of your fantasy football drafts. So I'm using 4for4 ADP, using their consensus data, just kind of pointing out some targets you guys should be looking at this year in fantasy. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, subscribe, questions, comments, feel free to drop them down below. But let's just dive right into round one. In full transparency, I don't think there's one like crazy screaming value on the board. I ended up going with CeeDee Lamb. You could also make the argument for Jahmyr Gibbs. I have CeeDee Lamb ranked one spot higher in my rankings. So CeeDee Lamb's going as the wide receiver 2, the 105 according to consensus. I have him as my wide receiver 2, my 104. Also have Jahmyr Gibbs, one spot ahead at the 103. If you guys do want my full rankings, my top 200, those are going to be in the description. It's just free for you guys if you want to use those as a resource. But for CeeDee Lamb here, I think he is a legit contender to be the wide receiver 1 overall this season. 2023 averaged 23.7 PPR points per game. That's pretty much the identical production that Jamar Chase gave you last year. That's the 8th most fantasy points per game in a season by a wide receiver since 2000. So it really was like a true elite ceiling season from CeeDee Lamb. Last year wasn't great. Dak injury didn't help, but we do know he has like that peak outcome, in his range of outcomes here. He's averaging pretty much 10 targets a game over the last 3 seasons. He's the second most targeted wide receiver over that stretch, only behind Devontae Adams. And then this is an offense where you can see them having a boom year. Dak Prescott putting together a big season. When we're looking at like the quarterback betting lines, he's tied for the 3rd highest passing yard line, and then he is at 7th with his passing touchdowns. So good offense. We know CeeDee Lamb is a super talented wide receiver. You draft him at the 105, and he does have the upside to be the wide receiver 1 overall. I'd personally take him over both Saquon Barkley and Justin Jefferson. Every platform is going to be a little bit different, but sometimes you do see him going behind one or both of those guys. Now, moving into round 2, according to consensus ADP, Nico Collins is going here in the 2nd round. He really is like a pure 1-2 turn pick on a lot of platforms. If he's going round 2, I think he's just a truly amazing pick. Like, he's my 108. But I did want to talk about Brian Thomas Jr. for this section because I do think he's just more consistently kind of locked in that 2nd round. And I have Brian Thomas Jr. ranked as my 112. Bumped him up, I think, 1 spot ahead of Ashton Genty over the last week or so. I just think this is a situation where you look at his talent and the production he put together as a rookie in 2024, where you should not be able to draft him outside of the 1st round. He was the wide receiver 11 in points per game as a rookie, 87 receptions, almost 1,300 receiving yards, scored 10 touchdowns. He had the 6th highest scoring rookie wide receiver season of all time. In his last 6 games, he was an absolute monster. 22.9 points per game to close out the year, was averaging like 11.7 targets per game during that stretch, and that was with Mac Jones at quarterback. Like, he didn't even have T-Law for that final push and was still dominant. He can win down the field. He was 5th in deep targets, 5th in deep receiving yards. He's great after the catch, 4th in yak. He was 5th in touchdowns, getting into the end zone on a not-so-great offense, and then also very efficient. He was 8th in yards per route run. I'm very high on Liam Cohen. I think this Jaguars offense is one of those units that could really overachieve and really just turn things around from last year. So I think we could see T-Law's best year. You have this young, emerging wide receiver. I just think he's too talented to be slipping to like the 202, 203, 204, which you can see in a lot of drafts here with BTJ. Now, moving into round 3, my clear best pick here is going to be Chase Brown. He's going off the board as the running back 11, the 302. And earlier on in the offseason, like right after the 2024 season, before free agency, before the draft, I was kind of hesitant to commit to Chase Brown just because we have a long track record of these day 3 running backs who get a lot of work. They're productive for fantasy. They just don't have a ton of like job security long term. And so it was very possible that the Bengals brought in someone in free agency, like spent decent draft capital at the running back position, and they just didn't. Like, he survived the draft. He survived free agency. I think you could even make the case that this is like a worse running back room than it was last year, at least in terms of like legit competition. They cut Zach Moss, who was like the early season committee member last year. They added Samaje Perine, Taj Brooks, day 3. Maybe he pops, but like pretty unlikely. Samaje Perine, kind of like a washed veteran presence at this point. So it does seem like they're going to be committed to feeding Chase Brown. And like we saw in the 8 games without Zach Moss last year, the dude was a monster. So first 8 games of the season with Zach Moss, averaging 11.3 points per game. Once Zach Moss went down for the season, Chase Brown became an absolute workhorse, like 19 carries a game, 5.5 targets, averaging 21 PPR points per game. And that was really without hitting in the touchdown department. So he has workhorse upside on one of the best offenses in the NFL, has that receiving upside. I've moved him up to my 19th overall player, my running back 8. And when I lay this all out, I could even see a case for him being ranked higher. Like, the ceiling is very, very clear. If Chase Brown is slipping into round 3, I think he is such an easy guy to hit the draft button on. Now in round 4, let's take a look at another running back that I think is a really nice pick, and that is going to be Omarion Hampton. He's being drafted as the running back 15 at the 404, and I've been super in on Hampton from a redraft perspective, pretty much ever since the NFL draft. I felt like he had been consistently undervalued, and we had seen his price start to rise. I think like the Najee eye injury certainly helped, and I thought eventually he would kind of break into like round 3 ADP on most platforms. I still think he would have been a value, but I think the recent Rashawn Slater injury is probably going to prevent that from happening, and I think he's probably going to be capped as like a round 4 redraft pick. Now, I have him going mid-round 3 in my rankings. He's my running back 12, my 306. I have him in a tier with Kenneth Walker, James Cook, Kyron Williams. Now, 306 admittedly does seem high, but like that mid to late round 3 area is just so gross. It is kind of like just a bunch of names in there. Like you could go for some of the lower upside wide receivers, like the Garrett Wilsons, the JSNs, guys like that. You could look at like Jalen Hurts, Jaden Daniels. It doesn't feel great picking in that range, but I'd be fine if push came to shove taking Omarion Hampton in the middle of the 3rd round. I think we're kind of just overthinking it at this point, and I think some people are going to use this Slater injury to be like, all right, now he's a way worse fantasy pick. But when we lay out kind of all the factors here, I still think he's a really strong value going in round 4. This is a round 1 running back pick with a 3-down skill set. Now he's playing behind an average offensive line, right? They went from probably top 5 to now around league average. That's still a fine situation to be in, right? Like, it's not like this was a bad offensive line and they just lost like an elite offensive lineman. This is still a solid unit around him. It's certainly a hit. I'm not saying it's not, but originally I had Hampton as like a 2-3 turn guy. I have adjusted and moved him back to like the middle of the 3rd round. I just think that type of profile is a bargain in round 4. The other piece of information that I've seen people kind of overreacting to is Greg Roman talking about wanting to use a rotation at running back. I think people are assuming this is now going to be some sort of like 50-50 split, or like he doesn't want anyone being the clear RB1. That's not how I personally interpreted it. I think that was more him saying like, we're not trying to give a running back like 80% of the opportunities, which that's not really what I was projecting here for Omarion Hampton. Like just last season with J.K. Dobbins, who should be a less talented player at that stage in his career, also with way more injury concerns, J.K. Dobbins had a 65% opportunity share. So Greg Roman didn't have any problem giving him some solid usage. We have Najee Harris as the main competition, and he's like just now participating in drills. We have no idea if he's going to be good to go week 1, what's really going on with his eye situation. And so I just think Omarion Hampton is a really nice pick in round 4. You're getting a young, talented running back in a situation that I still think is an overall positive, and I think you're getting him at a discount. Now, moving into round 5, I want to talk about Xavier Worthy, going right at the beginning of round 5, kind of 4-5 turn as the wide receiver 22. And I just think he has some rare upside that you typically don't see going in like the round 4-5 area. He is coming off a season where he was pretty underwhelming for like 70% of it, but then he was super impressive in like the last 30% to close the season, where the last 3 games of the regular season, or the 3 that he actually played in, he put up 21 PPR points per game. He was commanding volume, over 10 targets per game. And then he gets into the playoffs and he has 3 pretty productive performances. He goes 5 for 45, 6 for 85 and a touchdown, and then 8 for 157 and 2 touchdowns, 22.2 points per game in those 3 games. So last 3 games of the regular season, 3 in the playoffs, averaging 21.6 points per game. And I'm not even saying that Xavier Worthy is like some sort of like guaranteed hit or that he's a super high floor pick. I don't really think he is. I could see the path where this doesn't really work out and he's not super playable and, the pick is not all that great. but I think the upside is worth taking the swing here. And so I'm just kind of going to paint the picture on why I think Xavier Worthy could be like the league winning player in fantasy football in 2025. So we know this like Mahomes Chiefs offense does have a very high ceiling. They've had underwhelming back-to-back seasons, but this is still Mahomes at quarterback who hit 4,700 passing yards and 37 passing touchdowns in 4 of his first 5 seasons as the starter. And you could say, right, a lot of those seasons, really strong weapons. Tyreek Hill, Travis Kelce, even after losing Tyreek Hill, still threw for over 5,200 yards and 41 touchdowns. And so having that type of like offensive upside and being a potential wide receiver one on that unit is an extremely valuable role. You also have the Chiefs bracing for a Rashee Rice suspension. So the initial report was that they were bracing for like 4 to 6 games. Now we're getting new information that he's probably actually going to be available weeks 1 through 4 and then get suspended sometime after that, potentially week 5. Maybe it takes a couple of weeks for them to figure it out and he's getting suspended like, week 7. And I think there's some pros and cons to that kind of suspension timeline. The cons are that Rashee Rice has the opportunity to be super productive early on and potentially stamp his role. Whereas if Rashee Rice was suspended to start off the season, like Xavier Worthy might be able to step in and just, produce extremely well right away. But I also think this is potentially better for Xavier Worthy, where it's possible Rashee Rice is suspended like through the fantasy playoffs. Like that is not out of the question. And as they're kind of gaining momentum over the second half of the season, Rashee Rice isn't in there. It's still an opportunity for Xavier Worthy to establish his role and really kind of pull away in this wide receiver room. I also think there's a lot of room for Worthy and Mahomes to grow down the field. Mahomes and Worthy were like truly terrible connecting deep last year. Like that seemed to be the most interesting part of Worthy's game, like this deep speed threat for Patrick Mahomes to throw to. There were 42 quarterbacks last year with at least 16 deep targets. Mahomes was ranked 34th in completion percentage. The quarterbacks below him were Caleb Williams, Anthony Richardson, Daniel Jones, Jacoby Brissett, Deshaun Watson, Spencer Rattler, Mac Jones, and Drew Lock. That is not great company. It's actually back-to-back seasons where he has been bottom 10 in deep completion percentage, but it's not like this has been like his thing his entire career. Like the 2 prior seasons, 2021 and 2022, he was top 8 in that metric. And so, yeah, Mahomes has been underwhelming in back-to-back seasons, but we know that upside is there where he could, throw for 5,000 yards, 40 plus touchdowns. I have Xavier Worthy as my wide receiver 15 to 311. Now, you're pretty much not going to have to take him there on any platform, but that is how high I am on Xavier Worthy. I think the ceiling is worth taking a swing on. And I think the late season breakout we saw last year gives me enough confidence that this could be like a realistic, ceiling outcome for him. Now, moving into round 6, actually going to talk about 2 rookies here, RJ Harvey and Travis Hunter. And these were both guys that I was pretty high on heading into redraft. And I think both of them just got some really solid usage in the first preseason game. So starting off here with RJ Harvey, he's the running back 24 at the 605. And, there have been reports out of training camp, J.K. Dobbins, running back 1. I think you had RJ Harvey like RB5 on the depth chart. Some people are going to freak out about that. Different teams handle rookies on the depth chart differently. That was not a big concern for me. But we see in the preseason, both these guys played on the 1st through the 3rd drive. We saw RJ Harvey take 67% of the snaps. He saw 7 carries, 2 targets on 5 routes. This data is from Fantasy Life. They have a really good write-up of all the fantasy relevant options, their usage in those preseason games. And so I'm not going to say that that's the usage I'm expecting week 1. I don't think RJ Harvey's taken 67% of the snaps in the first week of the NFL season, but I'm also not someone who was buying into that J.K. Dobbins clear-cut RB1 role. And I think the usage we did see in the preseason, could imply that I'm a little bit more confident in him playing week 1 than even I thought was potentially the case, a couple of weeks ago. So overall, this is a very valuable backfield. Harvey has a fun fantasy skill set where he doesn't need a super high opportunity share. He can be in that Jahmyr Gibbs-esque usage where he's hitting on big plays, he's involved as a pass catcher, he's getting into the end zone. And this whole J.K. Dobbins thing, I like Dobbins. I think he's a good player. But this idea that J.K. Dobbins is going to be able to hold off R.J. Harvey for the whole season, I just think is crazy. The Broncos reached to draft R.J. Harvey in the 2nd round. J.K. Dobbins was unsigned through the NFL draft. I think they can coexist on the same team, but R.J. Harvey is the guy you want here. And I think in round 6, with that type of upside, especially those late season rookie running backs who can be those league winners, I'll be taking him in the middle of the 6th round, all day long. And then for Travis Hunter here, now I've pretty consistently been higher on Hunter than consensus. This is not going to be some sort of like victory lap. I feel like you could have pretty much any take on Travis Hunter, and it's tough for people to argue against it just because, like, we've never seen this before. This is a very unique situation. So if you're all in because he's so talented and you just want to believe in that, I completely understand that. If you're just out on him because you're like, I don't want someone who's going to be playing on defense, I can't really fault that either. Personally, I'm willing to buy into the upside here because I do think he is just a freak talent, and I do want to take a swing on that guy. And so we had the preseason game where he plays 88% of the snaps with the starters on offense, 50% of those snaps from the slot, which is really, really fun usage. We also have head coach Liam Cohen. He was asked to put a number on Hunter's offensive snaps, and he said like 80% or so. That's really all we need. Like, if you're giving me 80% snap share for Travis Hunter, I feel amazing drafting him here. This is a young, fun wide receiver that I think is on an offense that could boom this year. Travis Hunter, 607. I understand the risk is there, but I think all the signs, whether it's, coming from the head coach or just the usage we saw, is definitely pointing in a very, very positive direction. Now, in round 7, I actually have Tony Pollard here, and he's definitely not someone I thought I'd be talking about here. Didn't think I'd be super in on him, but you look at the consensus ADP, RB28, 701. I think this is a very fair spot to take him, and I think he looked much better in 2024. It was his second season removed from that tightrope procedure, which really kind of, stunted his efficiency, his athleticism in that 2023 season with the Cowboys. Like, that should have been his big breakout year. It just didn't happen, but he did bounce back. The fantasy production wasn't as great, but it was just due to being in a significantly worse situation with the Titans. He was still top 10 in opportunity share, carries, targets. That led to 12.5 points per game, but he only scored 5 touchdowns. And this was just, like I said, a bad situation. He wasn't going to get a ton of help from the guys around him. The team was 27th in points per game. I think this year could, repeat potentially in the usage department. But I think with Cam Ward coming in, potentially giving this offense a higher ceiling, we could see more touchdown upside, more efficiency out of Tony Pollard, and he's going to have that runway right away to be a workhorse with Tajay Spears suffering a high ankle sprain. Those things can linger, and so if you were someone who thought this was going to be like a committee, Tajay Spears, pushing for 40% of the opportunities, I thought that was possible, but I do think the Spears high ankle sprain kind of does put a damper on that. So I feel like Tony Pollard is a really strong RB3 option. I think he's a very viable pick in 0 RB teams to be your RB1 or 2, RB2 option if you're going hero RB. And so I have him as my running back 26 as a mid-round 6 pick. And typically when we're getting into round 6, round 7, round 8, it's the wide receivers that I think are really solid values. And so I do think it's notable that I do really like Tony Pollard at this spot. Now, looking at round 8, I want to talk about Ricky Pearsall here. He's being drafted as the wide receiver 42, the 808. And admittedly, the jury is still out on the talent of Ricky Pearsall. He had a very tough rookie season to gauge where the dude was shot before the season. Obviously, a very unique situation. He didn't play until week 7. And you're not really expecting him to just step right in, not being on the field with the team as a young player after getting shot and produce right away. So kind of underwhelming production, but then he has this really strong close to the season where in week 17, he goes 8 for 141 and a touchdown. And then week 18, he goes 6 for 69 and a touchdown. And this is just a spot where I'm willing to take a swing on the talent, given the offensive situation he's in, some of the issues with some of the other weapons where this is just a very fragile kind of core of weapons here where you have Brandon Ayuk, who's targeting a week 6 return. There's no guarantee he's at all productive this season. You have Juwan Jennings, who's dealing with his second calf injury of the offseason, also has his own weird contract situation. You have Christian McCaffrey, who is super injury prone. You have George Kittle, who certainly seems the most secure, but is still kind of getting up there at 32 years old, and we could see a dip in play, increased injury risk. So if the talent is there, and if he is good enough, right, round 1 pick, he has a real path to breaking out this season on an offense that I do think is going to be good, pretty much whoever they're throwing out there. So now moving into round 9, have a couple more young wide receivers. Both these guys are actually going to be rookies. It is Matthew Golden and Emeka Egbuka. So Golden is going off the board as the wide receiver 45, the 902. Egbuka is going off the board as the wide receiver 47, the 905. And I do think it's interesting when you kind of transition from doing like the dynasty fantasy football content to redraft, where there are certain players that you don't necessarily love in dynasty, but you're very in on in redraft. And Matthew Golden is one of those guys where I didn't really like him in terms of dynasty, not someone I was taking in a lot of my rookie drafts. But I think this is a very fair price here going into the redraft season. Dylan Sampson's another example where really didn't like him from a dynasty perspective, but with the Quinshon Judkins situation, all of a sudden I'm very, very in on Dylan Sampson. But we look at Matthew Golden here, and even though I didn't really deem him to be like a round 1 worthy wide receiver pick, he goes in round 1 to the Packers. The Packers clearly like him. He's going to a good offense, a passing attack I trust with LaFleur, Jordan Love at quarterback. And then this is just a wide open wide receiver room where it's kind of crowded. There's a lot of names, but you don't really have any like locked in studs. And we saw Matthew Golden playing 2 wide receiver sets in the preseason with Romeo Doubs. Now that was with Jaden Reed and Dontavian Wicks out with injury, but Jaden Reed, we don't even know if he's going to be ready week 1. Jaden Reed was someone who I was pretty interested in, but this injury definitely kind of, makes him feel like a less secure bet. But Matthew Golden's been getting great reports out of camp. If he can truly break into those 2 wide receiver sets, I think he has a great shot to be at least somewhat relevant for fantasy. And I am someone who just likes throwing darts at these young rookie wide receivers. They do have a lot of upside, right? Like this could be last year's BTJ or like a Lad McConkey, players like that who can really pop and be fantasy league winners. So I have him as my wide receiver 39 as like an early round 7 value in round 9. Very fine drafting Matthew Golden. And then the other guy here, Emeka Egbuka. I'm just fully in on Emeka Egbuka. I have him 1 spot ahead of Matthew Golden in my personal rankings. And I think this is an interesting situation where I view Emeka Egbuka as the significantly better prospect, but he definitely has just like tougher competition, a tougher path to like seeing the field and seeing meaningful usage. And so like my pitch throughout this offseason when Egbuka was going a little bit later was like, you just want to bet on the talent. You're betting on the uncertainty of, Godwin coming off an injury, Mike Evans kind of getting up there in age where Egbuka could have an opportunity and he has that potential to pop. I'm just feeling more and more confident that Egbuka is going to be a factor this season, pretty much regardless on what happens with Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. Like Evans is 32 years old. He's had hamstring strains the last 4 seasons. Godwin still isn't practicing, and Egbuka is just getting a crazy amount of hype coming out of camp. I just feel very confident that he is going to be involved. Even if Godwin's back week 1 and Mike Evans stays healthy, I kind of just feel like Egbuka is good enough that he will play a role on this roster. So Egbuka in round 9, I just think too talented to be going this late. And then the final round we'll be talking about in this video, round 10, I'm going to be going with Josh Downs. If you guys have been watching my videos, you know I'm very in on Josh Downs. Wide receiver 48, 1001, in my opinion, is just crazy. This dude was the wide receiver 28 in points per game last year on an awful offense, terrible passing numbers, 25th in passing yards, 27th in pass attempts, 27th in passing touchdowns. With like other competition, right? Michael Pittman, you had Adonai Mitchell, who didn't do anything, but like could have been viewed as competition. Alec Pierce, like this is not a bad group of weapons with terrible quarterback play, especially from a passing, angle. And Josh Downs was still the wide receiver 28 in points per game. He commands targets at a very high level, had the 6th highest target rate. It's not like he's some old washed up player that you think is going to take a dip. He's heading into year 3 and could have like a legit breakout this season. So he is way too talented, way too good to be drafted as the wide receiver 48. I have him as like a round 7 value, and you can get him potentially 3 rounds later. He's probably going to be like my most drafted player this year for fantasy. I'm very, very in on Josh Downs. But that is going to wrap it up for my favorite pick in every round of your fantasy drafts. Tomorrow, I will have the opposite video. So my least favorite picks, stay tuned for that. If you want the rankings, the top 200, those are in the description. But thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.